On October 17, 1777, British General John Burgoyne did something no British commander had done before in this conflict. He walked onto a field in New York and surrendered his entire army, nearly 6,000 professional soldiers, to a force of colonial militia. This was a total capitulation. An entire imperial army laid down its weapons and marched off the field as prisoners of war. So how did the world's greatest military power get trapped in the New York woods? Why did a meticulously planned invasion fall apart so quickly? And how did this single isolated surrender pull the rest of the world into the fight? The collapse at Saratoga was a fatal blow to British imperial strategy. It broke their grip on the colonies and set off a chain reaction that pulled rival superpowers into the fight. To see how it went wrong, we have to rewind to earlier in 1777. 2 years into the war, the British desperately needed a decisive victory. The Battle of Bunker Hill had already taught them that marching in straight lines against entrenched colonial militia was too bloody and too slow. Looking at this historical map, their objective was the Hudson River, acting as a physical dividing line through New York. A massive pincer movement was designed, General Burgoyne pushing south from Canada, another force east, and General Howe north, converging on Albany simultaneously. On paper, this plan was brilliant. By securing that river line, Britain would isolate New England completely, starving the heart of the rebellion of all outside support and crushing it from the outside in. But this animated diagram shows how quickly the reality on the ground fell apart. Instead of marching north, General Howe pivoted toward Philadelphia to chase George Washington. Meanwhile, the western thrust hit fierce resistance and was forced into a full retreat. That left Burgoyne marching south from Canada completely alone. And he was commanding a massive, slow-moving, European-style army. His column was weighed down by heavy artillery, sprawling supply trains, and his own extensive personal luxuries, all dragging through an untamed, heavily forested wilderness. The colonial militia exploited every inch of that geography. They felled massive trees across the narrow dirt roads, burned the bridges ahead of the British advance, and picked off soldiers from the tree line in constant guerrilla ambushes. Every single mile Burgoyne advanced cost him something he could not replace. He was bleeding time, losing men, and burning through essential supplies. A flawless theoretical invasion was dismantled by rogue commanders and brutal geography, turning a confident march into a grueling logistical death march. By the time Burgoyne's exhausted and starving force reached the area near Saratoga in September, they found General Horatio Gates waiting for them. And Gates's American army was only growing larger as local militia poured in from the surrounding countryside. The two sides collided at Freeman's Farm. American forces, relying heavily on riflemen and sharpshooters, heavily targeted the British command structure. They inflicted devastating casualties on British officers before finally giving up the physical ground. The climax came weeks later in early October at the Battle of Bemis Heights. Burgoyne was heavily outnumbered and launched a desperate, sprawling attack to try and break out of the American encirclement. His lines were ultimately shattered. Benedict Arnold, defying direct orders, led a chaotic, reckless charge that tore right through the key British defensive positions. The aftermath was absolute. Burgoyne's army was entirely surrounded. Their retreat lines back to Canada were blocked. They were entirely out of food. And on October 17th, they surrendered. The physical trapping and capture of a massive British army in the woods of New York shattered the enduring myth of British invincibility in North America. The most important reaction to this surrender happened across the Atlantic, in Paris. The French had been quietly funneling covert money and weapons to the Americans for a while, staying officially out of sight. King Louis XVI's government was highly pragmatic. They refused to openly commit French military forces to a colonial rebellion that was statistically likely to collapse at any moment. Then, the news of Saratoga arrived on their desks. This was the undeniable proof of concept France demanded. It proved the Americans were actually capable of capturing an entire British army, giving France the perfect, calculated opportunity to strike back at Britain and avenge their own past military defeats. Within months, the diplomatic dominoes fell. France formally recognized American independence and signed a military treaty of alliance. The most critical asset France brought to the fight was a powerful navy. For the first time, the colonies had an allied fleet, capable of actively challenging British dominion over the oceans. As we can see on this map, the conflict immediately expanded. Following France's lead, Spain and the Dutch Republic soon entered the fight, dropping new battlefronts across Europe, the Caribbean, and India. A localized rebellion exploded into a multi-theater global war. Before Saratoga, the Americans were an isolated group of colonists hoping to simply outlast an empire. After Saratoga, they were backed by global superpowers, immense financial resources, and fully equipped militaries. Saratoga earns its title as the turning point of the revolution because it forged a credible global path to victory. It was the catalyst that set the stage for the final British surrender on a field in Yorktown.